Mr. President, as my friend, the Republican leader, likes to remind us, the Senate's not just a legislative body. We're also in the personnel business. One of the Senate's core responsibilities is to provide advice and consent for the President's nominees for a range of important jobs throughout the federal government. In fact, it's a constitutional duty of the Senate to perform that function. When the President is of the opposing party, there's all but a guarantee that you will not see eye to eye with every nominee. But the process isn't just about politics or judging nominees based on whether their opinions align with your own or not. As I see it, we are charged with evaluating these individuals to see if they're qualified not only to carry out the duties of their position, but will also do so with honor and integrity. Take Attorney General Merrick Garland, for example. When the Senate considered his nomination, it became clear that he had both the experience and the temperament to lead the Department of Justice. Do we agree on everything? No. But he committed to do everything in his power to keep politics out of the Department of Justice. And I have no reason to doubt his credibility. The same can be said of the President's nominee for Deputy Attorney General, Lisa Monaco, who was confirmed yesterday by the Senate. Ms. Monaco is a longtime public servant who previously served for 15 years at the Department of Justice. Throughout her career, she's earned the respect of folks on both sides of the aisle, and I believe she'll bring a wealth of experience and institutional knowledge to the department. So my point is, I've supported the majority of President Biden's nominees thus far, and every single nominee has received bipartisan support at some level. But unfortunately, it looks like we're about ready to break that record of bipartisanship. Today, the Senate will vote on the nomination of Vanita Gupta to serve as Associate Attorney General, the third highest official at the Department of Justice. Unlike previous nominees that have received bipartisan support, there is not a single person on this side of the aisle who believes that Ms. Gupta is fit to serve as the third in command at the Department of Justice. I can't predict what the final vote will be. It will be at 2:30, but I hear nobody on this side of the aisle saying that she is an exemplar of the type of person who should serve in the Department of Justice. As I said, this is not about politics, nor are those of us who are opposed to her nomination opposed because of her gender or race. To the contrary, those are irrelevant. Instead, the lack of support for Ms. Gupta is a result of her radical record far outside the mainstream and her career as a partisan activist. In fact, she's championed radical policies basically all of her professional career. In addition, throughout the confirmation process, Ms. Gupta was asked about the long list of controversial, misleading, and sometimes outright false public statements that she has made in the past. Her statement before the judiciary last summer, for example, that we should effectively defund the police. Her op-ed that argued we should effectively revoke qualified immunity for law enforcement in civil lawsuits. But worst of all were her prior statements on drug policy. In 2012, Ms. Gupta wrote in an op-ed in the Huffington Post, "States should decriminalize simple possession of all drugs." All drugs. This is obviously an incredibly controversial statement and way out of step with most Americans' views, for good reason. What she said is, as long as they were small amounts, she would legalize heroin, fentanyl, cocaine, ecstasy, methamphetamine, you name it. When Ms. Gupta tried to distance herself from these previous positions that are published in black and white, here's what the Washington Post fact-checkers said. They said, for this tango of previously unacknowledged flip-flops, Gupta earns an upside-down Pinocchio. Now, I've seen a 1 Pinocchio, 2 Pinocchio, 3 Pinocchio, even a 4, but I've never seen an upside-down Pinocchio for a tango of previously unacknowledged flip-flops. The fact-checked examined Ms. Gupta's confusing then and now statements on police budgets, qualified immunity, and drug policy, and this is what they found. Now, I understand and respect the fact that people's opinions can change over time as we learn new information or have different experiences in life. We all understand that one's views can change. But there's a big difference between honestly forming a new opinion and undergoing a confirmation conversion to bury radical views on controversial subjects. After all, how could anyone support a nominee who advocated the decriminalization of all drugs, especially for the number 3 spot at the Department of Justice? I'm not sure anyone in this chamber, Republican or Democrat, could support someone to serve in the upper echelon of the Justice Department who supported the legalization of heroin, fentanyl, and other dangerous street narcotics. That's why she attempted to whitewash it. She knew she couldn't get nominated, much less confirmed, if she didn't. But here, Mr. President, is what we know about drug abuse in America. This is a map of national opioid death rates in America. As you can see, they go from the dark colors, that's where the death rate is 29 to 43 per 100,000 population, to the slightly lighter range, which is 20 to 29 roughly people per 100,000, and then the lighter ones, obviously, until you get to the lowest one, which is 3.5 to 10.9. Every community in America has felt the pain and anguish from the opioid crisis. In 2019, there were more than 70,000 overdose deaths in America. 70,000 Americans lost their lives. We're still waiting on complete figures from 2020, but preliminary data shows things are trending in the wrong direction. From June 2019 through May 2020, more than 81,000 Americans have died from drug overdoses. Fighting the opioid epidemic is a cause every person in this chamber can get behind because, as you can see, each of our states has been impacted. In 2016, thanks to the hard work of a bipartisan group of senators, we passed what became known as the CARA Act, the Comprehensive Addiction and Recovery Act, to help more Americans break this devastating cycle of drug use, drug abuse, and overdose. And we've appropriated tens of billions of dollars to fight this scourge. As I said, and as you can see, no state has been spared the pain and suffering from the opioid epidemic. But we do know some have been hit harder than others. For example, one of the states with the darkest color, with the highest rate of overdose deaths, is Ohio. And we can see here what had happened in the period roughly from 2009 to 2017, or let me say 2019. From 2009 to 2019, 10 years, there were more than 33,000 drug overdoses and deaths in Ohio alone. 33,000 Ohioans, each with their unique value, contribution, and story. It's an absolutely heartbreaking number of deaths that should have been prevented. Another one of those states with the the worst problem with opioids was New Hampshire. In 2013, the drug overdose deaths per capita were slightly above the national average at 15 deaths per 100,000. In New Hampshire, in 2016, just 3 years later, the death rate increased 158%. First responders across New Hampshire experienced a dramatic increase in the calls they got for overdoses. And so they started carrying Narcan, a medication used to reverse an overdose if you get there in time before the overdosed individual dies. But they carried them in their emergency gear because these overdose calls became so common. Another one of those states hit particularly hard was West Virginia. In 2019, West Virginia had the highest overdose deaths per capita. For every 100,000 drug overdose deaths, for every 100,000 population, more than 52 were from an overdose, double the national figure. 21.6 per 100,000 that went up, that's the national, and the West Virginia number is double, as you can see. Our friend Senator Capito has been a tireless advocate for West Virginia families, many of whom have felt the pain of this crisis firsthand. She recently wrote an op-ed about this nominee and the contradictory and confounding statements she's made in the past, particularly on drug policy. Senator Capito wrote, "It's hard to imagine the level of devastation that we would see if all of these drugs actually were legalized. And it's even harder to imagine that a nominee for a critical law enforcement position would hold this view." I completely agree with our friend from West Virginia. Given the ruin that the opioid epidemic has dealt in communities across the country, I can't even begin to imagine how much worse it would be had the states heeded Ms. Gupta's call to decriminalize all drugs for personal use. If fentanyl, heroin, methamphetamine, and other highly addictive drugs were decriminalized, how many more Americans would become addicted? How many more would have died? How many more families would suffer the loss of a child, a sibling, a parent? Mr. President, I'm profoundly concerned by Ms. Gupta's prior statements on drug policy, as well as her radical statements on defunding the police, disarming the police in civil lawsuits by eliminating qualified immunity, abolishing the death penalty for the most heinous crimes, and so much more. Worse, though, is her inability to be honest about her position on issues that would directly fall within her purview at the Department of Justice. The American people deserve to know that leaders at any government department or agency, but especially the Department of Justice, they deserve to know that these public servants are honest and will tell them the truth. As Ms. Gupta's upside-down Pinocchio indicates, no senator can have the confidence that Ms. Gupta would be honest with them or tell them the truth. We hold hearings. We put witnesses under oath, promising to tell the truth, the whole truth, nothing but the truth, so help me God. And we don't expect people will come into those hearings and lie. We ask follow-up questions. Perhaps there was some misunderstanding that you'd like to clear up. Believe it or not, Ms. Gupta answered a written question under oath stating that she had never advocated for the decriminalization of all drugs, even though in 2012, in an op-ed she published in the HuffPost, she did exactly that, but then for some reason decided to lie about it under oath to the United States Senate Judiciary Committee. If she would lie to us, she would lie to you. And I fail to see how, for some reason we think she will change the way she acts or behaves or improve her standard of behavior when it comes to honesty and truthfulness. We hold these hearings and ask these questions to understand the opinions and the character and the motivation of these nominees. But based on what the Senate has learned about Vanita Gupta, I don't believe she's fit to serve as the Associate Attorney General. The Department of Justice, perhaps more than any other department or agency, must be led by men and women of honesty and integrity. People like Merrick Garland, people like Lisa Monaco, that received overwhelming bipartisan votes here on the Senate floor. High-ranking public officials at the Department of Justice cannot be motivated by partisanship. They must pursue no other agenda other than fair and impartial justice. In contrast, Ms. Gupta has shown she is a partisan activist with a penchant for skirting the truth. If confirmed as Associate Attorney General, I believe she has the potential to use the powerful tools at the Department of Justice to wage partisan warfare that has been part of her professional career to this point. If we can't trust her to be honest with us, how can we expect her to fulfill her duty of candor in courtrooms, including all aspects of the legal process that depend on honest, truthful answers and communications? If we can't depend on her to tell the truth to the Senate Judiciary Committee in the confirmation hearing, how can we depend on her to exercise her duty of candor when applying for a warrant from the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court, for example? Sadly, I believe Ms. Gupta will be a clear and present danger to the American people if she's given the muscle and might of the Department of Justice, as well as the entire federal government of the United States of America. Mr. President, I cannot support her nomination, and I would urge all of my colleagues to do likewise. Mr. President, I yield.
Mr. President.
The Majority Whip.
Mr. President, it's been many years ago that I went to law school. And I still remember some of the courses and some of the teachers and certainly some of my grades. One of the most interesting courses should have been required of every student in every law school in America, and it basically was about this document, this Constitution. Because in its simplicity, you're sometimes put off by the fact that there's real wisdom behind the words, and applying them in real life can take twists and turns. I found one way, a quick course in constitutional law where average people come to understand the Bill of Rights better than most. And I found this when I was practicing law in Springfield, Illinois, and I would get a telephone call from a parent who would say to me, "Durbin, you got to help me. They arrested my 17-year-old son for possession of marijuana. What are his rights under the Constitution? Did they give him a Miranda warning?" And I started hearing things from parents coming back to me about this document, which I was surprised to hear. The point I'm trying to make is this: that many years ago when I was practicing law in Springfield, Illinois, we were going through a learning process about drugs and addiction. And it has continued to this day. In fact, I don't believe there's a single senator on either side of the aisle who would say, "You know, I've been here 20 years or plus, I've never changed my views on drugs." Maybe some feel that way. I'm not one of them. There have been dramatic changes in the American attitude toward drugs. I think we know that, obviously. There have been changes in many states. In my state of Illinois, I think about that parent who called so many years ago in a state where the sale and possession of marijuana and products made with marijuana is now legal and taxed. Things have changed dramatically when it comes to drugs. There are very few people who hold to the old school, which says simple possession of one marijuana cigarette, we're going to put you in jail and throw away the key. No, it's changed a lot. In fact, it's changed in Washington so much so that there was a bill called the First Step Act. The First Step Act was a bill that I worked on with Senator Grassley and Senator Lee and Senator Booker, who is here today, that basically said we are changing our attitude toward drugs. Simple possession of a small amount of drugs will not require a mandatory minimum sentence, because we'd seen the terrible outcome otherwise. We put that bill together on a bipartisan basis, and President Donald Trump signed the bill into law. Not only signed it, but came before us in the State of the Union address and was proud of the fact that he had changed and reformed drug laws. So when I hear the arguments made on the floor that perhaps some nominee coming before us may have changed her or his opinion on drugs, I say America has, by and large. Think about what's happened with this opioid crisis. Now that it's no longer just an underlined, an inner city crime, but a crime that affects families that live in wealthy suburbs, we now are looking at addiction so differently. So let's go to this issue of Vanita Gupta and her positions on drugs. In questions for the record, Senator Cornyn, the senior senator from Texas, asked Vanita Gupta, what research, books, studies, and other material did you rely on before concluding that, quote, all drugs should be legal? Gupta said that she's never said all drugs should be legal or completely decriminalized. And in his floor speech last week, Senator Cornyn claimed 15 times that Gupta had lied in response to this question. Senator Cornyn held up a poster purporting to show that Gupta denied ever making a 2012 statement in favor of decriminalizing the simple possession of small amounts of drugs. The senator said, if you published an op-ed saying the sky is purple and now you say the sky is blue, don't tell us you never thought the sky was purple. Senator Cornyn's claim, I'm afraid, is false. Vanita Gupta was completely honest and forthright. Cornyn's poster left out the very next sentence of Gupta's response, in which she clearly acknowledged her past position on decriminalizing the simple possession of drugs. Gupta stated, and I quote, I have never advocated for the decriminalization of all drugs, and I do not support the decriminalization of all drugs. In 2012, 9 years ago, I co-authored an article that advocated for states to decriminalize and defelonize simple possession of all drugs, particularly marijuana, and for small amounts of other drugs. Does this sound like a person who is on a crusade to promote fentanyl, opioids, heroin? It sounds like a person who might have voted for the First Step Act, signed into law by President Donald Trump, who said we have to take an honest look at what arrest and imprisonment for simple possession of drugs has done to America. When 1 out of 3 black adults, males, have unfortunately a history of incarceration, it raises a question about over-incarcerating for possession of drugs. So I think this argument that she cannot be trusted on the issue of drugs falls apart when you read what she actually said. Then there's a question of defunding the police. I don't know who dreamed up that phrase. I don't think much of it. I've never espoused it nor argued for it because I think it's so misleading and in many respects has been exploited. Republicans like to claim that Vanita Gupta supports efforts to defund the police. She's never called for defunding the police. Suggestions she's done so, including an ad by the conservative dark money funded Judicial Crisis Network. They pop up around here whenever mysterious groups want to spend millions of dollars and discredit someone. These claims in that ad are patently false. A Washington Post editorial wrote of the Judicial Crisis Network claim, awkwardly, there's zero proof of that, including in the ad's own footnoted citation. The Washington Post called Judicial Crisis Network's ad a baseless smear campaign, categorically dishonest, and mainly notable for the magnitude of lies and distortions it crams into 30 seconds. And listen to the response and the source. The executive director of the National Fraternal Order of Police, Jim Pascoe, called this ad that claimed that Gupta wanted to defund the police. You know what he called it? Partisan demagoguery. And yet we still hear it on the floor of the Senate as if it's gospel truth. The Fraternal Order of Police supports Vanita Gupta's nomination to this position in the Department of Justice, and they aren't the only ones. Virtually every major law enforcement group supports Vanita Gupta. You wouldn't know that, would you? When you hear on the floor that she wants to legalize all drugs and take the money away from the police. Those simplistic statements belie the truth and the fact that these organizations support her. The Republicans, starting with Senator McConnell and continuing to this moment, will not acknowledge the obvious. These are hard-nosed organizations that don't give their endorsement out easily. And they weren't fooled by Vanita Gupta. They know Vanita Gupta. In a letter to the Senate endorsing Gupta's nomination, the president of the major county sheriffs associations of America, it's a pretty hard-nosed group. Here's what they wrote. During our meetings, Ms. Gupta emphasized that she does not support efforts to defund the police. They addressed it directly. They didn't beat around the bush. You don't expect them to, do you? During her tenure at the Justice Department, Vanita Gupta worked closely with law enforcement, which is why the Senate has received numerous letters of support for her nomination from law enforcement groups. I could go through the list, and it's long. I won't. Trust me. It's all been entered into the record. Every senator, Democrat and Republican, has had a chance to see it. But I think there is something more fundamental to this nomination, which we are considering Wednesday, April 21st, in the year 2021. Late yesterday afternoon, a verdict in a trial in Minnesota captured the attention of America and other places around the world. We all know what it was about. It was about the death of George Floyd and the culpability of a law enforcement officer in his death. It was a trial that was followed as closely as any trial that I can remember. And the verdict against the police officer gave some people the hope that we are finally going to walk down that path again of civil rights and be honest about it and demand equality under the law for everyone in this country in the enforcement of law. I hope that happens, and I hope that we can be a part of it, and we should be in the United States Senate. But I will tell you, and I can predict with certainty, it is going to be a rocky path for those advocates for asserting civil rights. History's shown it, and many of us have lived it, at least as witnesses, that those who step out and speak out for civil rights and human rights often pay a heavy price. One of the people in our history, our recent history, who has done just that is Vanita Gupta, the nominee who's before us today. I mentioned earlier, and I want to commend to my colleagues and anyone else, this book, Tulia, written by a man named Nate Blakesley. It's a story of a town in Texas. I want to briefly describe to you why they would write a book about this town in Texas.
Mr. President, at the appropriate time, I would ask the senator to yield for a brief question, but sure. I don't want to interrupt his train of thought.
Let me read the summary of this book in the book cover. I've had a chance to read parts of it, but not in its entirety. Here's what it says. Early one morning in the summer of 1999, authorities in the tiny West Texas town of Tulia began a roundup of suspected drug dealers. By the time the sweep was done, over 40 people had been arrested, and one out of every five black adults in town was behind bars. all accused of dealing cocaine to the same undercover officer, Tom Coleman. Coleman, the son of a well-known Texas Ranger, had been named Officer of the Year in Texas. Not until after the trials, in which Coleman's uncorroborated testimony secured sentences as long as 361 years, did it become apparent that Coleman was not the man he claimed to be. By then, 24 people were in prison, and the town of Tulia had become a battlefield in the national debate over the war on drugs. And there they sat, dozens of them in prison, accused of serious drug crimes. And then a young lady graduated from law school and went to work in the area of civil rights. 6 months out of law school, she traveled to Tulia, Texas. Her assignment, bring justice to the situation. I can't imagine 6 months out of law school, barely having passed some state's bar exam, to be given that assignment. The woman, of course, was Vanita Gupta. And she got on a plane from New York. Her civil rights organization sent her to Tulia, Texas, to take on this injustice. By then, they were all sitting in jail. Most of them were African American. And she was sent to Tulia, Texas, to rescue them and try to help. Well, she quickly assessed the situation, decided writs of habeas corpus would have to be filed to try to get reconsideration of the charges against these individuals, and then she quickly realized she was in over her head. She couldn't do this alone. There were too many cases. So she went back to New York and started calling law firms, saying, I need your help. I need pro bono attorneys, volunteer attorneys that'll help me do this case. She tackled it and took it on. And at the end of the day, this brave young woman, whom we are about to vote on in an hour and a half, this brave young woman was responsible for leading a team that liberated these prisoners. The Republican governor of the state of Texas officially pardoned them for the drug crimes they'd been charged with, and the state of Texas offered damages to them for what they had suffered. I can't imagine Vanita Gupta, fresh out of law school, heading down to this town in Texas and tackling this. How about that for your first assignment? Most new lawyers are stuck in the library looking up footnotes and cases. She didn't waste any time but to go down there. The reason I raise that is, at this moment today, not even 24 hours after the verdict in the trial in Minneapolis, we're going to need people just like her who have the courage to stand up for civil rights against what seem to be insurmountable odds, to bring back this nation of ours, black and white and brown, together in moving forward. I don't believe she should be discredited, dishonored by what is said on the floor of the Senate. She should be praised for her courage and determination. She went on to serve in the Department of Justice as the head of the Civil Rights Division. She took that responsibility, and that is not an easy assignment. Many times that division is called on to deal with police departments and law enforcement and to tell them the bad news that sometimes they've done things that are just plain wrong and unacceptable. She did it. She did it with class, with integrity, and the same law enforcement organizations have endorsed her today. The Republicans who criticize her, and they've come to the floor and called her a radical cultural warrior. Radical cultural warrior. Recently, she was just called on the floor a clear and present danger. I find it hard to imagine that anyone could read or know of any section of what she did in this book and describe her as a radical cultural warrior. She brought justice to a situation where few people could have done it, and did it fresh out of law school. She's an extraordinary person. She is a courageous person. She is a person of integrity and honesty and dedication to public service. I am happy to support her nomination, and I will yield for a question.
The senator yield for a question.
I yield for a question.
This is the quote from the article that Vanita Gupta wrote on November the 4th, 2012, said states should decriminalize simple possession of all drugs, particularly marijuana, and for small amounts of other drugs. And then in her sworn testimony, and in response to written questions, she said, I have never advocated for the decriminalization of all drugs. And I do not support the decriminalization of all drugs. 2012, support the decriminalization of all drugs. 2021, I have never supported the decriminalization of all drugs. I wonder if my colleague, I just simply can't reconcile those two statements, both given under oath to the Judiciary Committee. Can you reconcile those statements?
Thank you, Senator. I will reconcile it in the words of Vanita Gupta. In 2012, I co-authored an article that advocated for states to decriminalize and defelonize simple possession of all drugs, particularly marijuana, and for small amounts of other drugs. How much more clarity do you need? Now, you and I know that we live by our words. And many times, even as senators, people find statements and speeches that we have made and come back and challenge us. And I would just say her statement is not only clear, it is a mainstream statement. To argue that this woman is for legalizing all drugs, as some have suggested, is ridiculous. She has never said that, and she has made it clear what her position is. And it is a position which most Americans share.
Mr. President, I would ask Senator Yield for one last question. We can all understand how people's views change over time, but there is no way to reconcile these two statements, 2012 and 2021, which is the reason I believe that Ms. Gupta, for some reason lost to me, decided to tell the Senate Judiciary Committee two inherently conflicting statements under oath. She could have gotten out of it the easy way and said, well, I made a mistake, or I forgot, my views changed over time, and I would have accepted that. But to come back on questions for the record and to state something that is 180 degrees opposed to her views in 2012, I have not heard her. I have not heard the distinguished Majority Whip. I have not heard anybody be able to reconcile those two statements.
Mr. President, if I reclaim my time, if the gentleman is finished, the senator is finished. So do you believe that the Fraternal Order of Police thinks that she wants to decriminalize and legalize all drugs? Do you think the County Sheriff's Association believes that? Do you think they ever would have endorsed her nomination if they believed that for 1 minute? They don't. I don't. Her words are clear. The senator from New Jersey, I have a question.
I appreciate this, and I want to acknowledge my speaking time was far earlier. I'm supposed to be presiding right now, but I did not want to get between. I am but a mouse in the United States Senate as a junior person. Those are two elephant titans over there. But I...
Pretty large mouse.
Yeah. So I appreciate the indulgence of the presiding officer. I wanted to just give general remarks about Vanita Gupta, but I would love to weigh in and maybe pick up exactly where Senator Durbin left off.
I tell you what, let me end my remarks then and just say to the senator from New Jersey, I'm here to listen to him as well, and to close by saying this extraordinary woman is presenting her credentials for approval by the United States Senate at exactly the right moment in history. We need in the Department of Justice Vanita Gupta, who has given a lifetime of courageous service in the pursuit of justice and the pursuit of civil rights. Is there a lesson from Minnesota that we should bring to the floor of the Senate? It's the fact that we need people like her who can communicate effectively with law enforcement and civil rights groups and resolve our differences more at this moment in history than ever. If you can still remember that verdict, and I'll remember it for a long, long time, as others will, when you cast your vote on the Senate floor today, vote for Vanita Gupta to be part of this Department of Justice team at this moment in American history. Never have we needed a person with her qualifications more than at this moment. I yield the floor.
Senator Durbin, I appreciate you quickly wrapping your remarks up and indulging me. I had some prepared remarks, but I want to break away from them.
The senator from New Jersey.
Thank you very much for the recognition. I think, I'm not sure, but I think I'm the only senator here that lives in a low-income black and brown community in the United States Senate. I live in a beautiful neighborhood in a beautiful central ward of Newark, New Jersey. We don't mistake wealth with worth. In fact, I went off to get fancy education. I may have got my BA from Stanford, but I got my PhD on the streets of Newark, learning from some of the most incredible people I've ever encountered in my life. If there's one lesson that I've learned early in my days in the 1990s, living in the central ward of Newark, at the height of the drug war, it's that this war on drugs was not a war on drugs, it was a war on people, and not all people, but certain people. It was a war on poor people. It was a war on black people. And it was destroying lives, that people were getting criminal convictions for doing things that 2 of the last 4 presidents admitted to doing. Simple possession. Getting criminal convictions for it. And here is what is even more anguishing at a time in the opioid addiction where everybody now is on the same page that people who are addicted deserve to have treatment. Back in those days, churned into the criminal justice system were African Americans for simple possession who were in desperate need of compassion and care and love and treatment. And this gets me to Vanita Gupta. I watched the 2 statements that my friend and colleague from Texas put up. They're screaming the difference between those 2 statements. I don't support the legalization of all drugs, but I do support the decriminalization of small amounts of drugs and getting people help and not a lifetime scarlet letter of being a convicted criminal. She does not support the criminalization of all drugs. I'm glad to see that she is looking at the challenge that we have in this country of arresting people that need help. And my friend Senator Durbin, with great patience and not relying on raising his voice like I do, a real gentleman, said it simply. Vanita Gupta is not a partisan. She's a patriot. Look at her career. I mean, my mom used to tell me, who you are speaks so loudly, I can't hear what you say. In other words, judge a person by what they have done in their life, how they have lived, where they've sacrificed, what commitments they have made. You chart Vanita's career from her activism in law school to defend the Constitution, from her very first assignment as a lawyer in Texas, defending an outrage of injustice and winning. Where are the people lining up to criticize her in those days working in her nonprofit work? And then for the great high salaries of Department of Justice workers, she goes to lead the Civil Rights Division. Is there people coming forward from their experiences? Are there police officers? Are there police agencies? Are there police groups coming forward to say, when she had that high and vaunted position in the Department of Justice, did she do something that so showed her partisanship? Not one, in fact, quite the contrary to that. Group after group of police organizations are coming forward and saying, she's not a partisan, she's a patriot. I stand by her. She's not a Democrat or Republican, she is an honest broker, a fair actor who pursues justice. She has conservatives who are partisans supporting her. I mean, that's the thing that gets me. We see partisan appointees all the time in here. But here is a woman who actually got people. Mark Holden from the Koch brothers organization is supporting her. So I understand that maybe people are taking words and twisting them. There's not a member of this body that hasn't had that experience to them. When the intention, the goodwill, the honesty behind the words is distorted and twisted by millions of dollars from outside organizations that somehow want to destroy this woman. I know Vanita Gupta. She's not just somebody I have a professional relationship with. I confess to the floor of the United States Senate. She has been my friend for years. I had occasion to talk to her dad, not during this time when she was nominated, months ago. God, the stories he related about her, the pride that beamed through the telephone about her, about how he came from India with $8 in his pocket with an immigrant's dream, and now he gets to see his daughters living lives of service, and how his children were wired this way to so appreciate this nation as immigrants, to know that this nation was formed around the highest ideals of humanity, and to see his two daughters pursuing the cause of our country to make this a more perfect union around the ideals of liberty and justice. That is Vanita Gupta's life. I've had private conversations with her for years about these issues that now she's being accused on, and she is not some radical partisan. She has a heart and a compassion for human beings that, to me, inspires my actions. And this is what hurts the most, because somehow I've seen it in our society when a woman stands up and is strong and defiantly dedicated to ideals that are not made real in reality. They are attacked again and again and again. I've seen it in my own party between presidential candidates. The treatment that the public and the press gives one who's the woman is far different than the same standards they put to the man. And then, God bless America, there's something about women of color that seems to really get them outrageous attacks. I've seen it through my culture's history. They hunted Harriet Tubman. They despised Sojourner Truth. They belittled Rosa Parks. There seems to be something about strength, something about talent, something about being willing to tell the truth that generates something. Tries to relegate black women and women of color to be hidden figures in history. I see it in every element of our country, even the medical profession, for God's sake. Even when you control for income and education, black women giving birth, their pain is not attended to. They're underestimated for the struggles they're in, and they die 4 times more likely than white women. And so with this woman I have known for years, I have seen her in private, in public. I've seen her go to work with Republicans, join arm in arm with them in bettering our country. I've seen her serve from her 20s and 30s. I've seen her be, in every step of her career, committed to our country, sacrifice for it. Here we stand on the Senate floor, and I tell you, on the day after the verdict to George Floyd, where I saw other patriots tell the truth on the stand, police officers break with the waves of history, the streams and currents, to tell the truth. This is a moment that I have to tell the truth. This is a good American, a great American, honest, committed, who has sacrificed for her country. And in a time of injustice still, where our jails and our prisons are filled with people who are hurt, when we, the land of the free, has 1 out of every 4 incarcerated people, and get this, 1 out of every 3 incarcerated women on the planet Earth in our jails and prisons, where almost 90% of them are survivors of sexual assault. This is the time we need more compassion. This is the time we need more empathy. This is the time we need more civic grace, towards one another. And Vanita embodies that. She stands for that in every fiber of her being. Her career echoes with that spirit. And should we confirm her to this position, I promise you here on the Senate floor, before the flag of my country, she will do this nation proud, committed. She will never mistake popularity for that purpose. She will never be distracted by the partisan games going on in the Capitol. She will be committed to the higher calling. I ask my colleagues to step back for a moment and see the truth of who she is, who police organizations say she is, who prominent conservatives say she is, to see the person her dad says she is, and elevate this incredible person, this incredible woman of color, to a position that desperately, to a nation that desperately needs this kind of leader. I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
Senator from Alaska.
Thank you, Mr. President. Before I begin my comments, Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that Christina Nelson, my Coast Guard fellow, be granted floor privileges for the remainder of her fellowship.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, I didn't come to the floor to speak to the nominee that is before us this afternoon, but following the very impassioned comments by colleagues, in fairness, on both sides of the aisle, and recognizing the vote that I just took about an hour ago to advance Vanita Gupta to this position, I will take just a moment to explain where I'm coming from and why I will be supporting her final confirmation in just an hour. I have looked at her record. I have had an extensive sit-down with her. I'm impressed with not only her professional credentials, but really the level of experience, but more to the comments that we just heard on the floor, the passion that she carries with her, with the work that she performs. I think it's fair to say we will all agree that her confirmation has been very challenged. She has had a significant back and forth in committee. She has been elevated with very strong rhetorical words in favor and equally words of condemnation. I asked her point blank, why do you want this? Is this worth it? Because this has been clearly very hard on her as a nominee. And she paused and reflected a moment and just spoke to how she feels called to serve in a very personal way that I thought was impactful. We had a long discussion about some of the issues that I care deeply about in my state as they relate to justice, access to justice, public safety, and the real tragedy that we face when it comes to women, primarily our Native women, who experience rates of domestic violence and sexual assault that are shocking, disturbing, and wrong. And despite all that we have as a state, the resources that we have, the opportunities that we have not been able to turn the corner as we have needed to in confronting what I believe is a true scourge. And it is going to take more than resources. Jurisdictionally, it is very complicated in Alaska. We don't have reservations. We don't have a similar law enforcement presence in many parts of the state that you might have in the lower 48. And we have a great deal of work to do as a state. But as we discussed these issues, I felt that I was speaking to a woman who had not only committed a professional life to try to get to the base of these injustices, to try to not just direct a little bit of money, put a program in place, and walk away and call it a day, but to truly try to make a difference. And so there are some statements that she has made in some other areas that, in fairness, I find troubling and concerning, and part of my job will be to ensure that she understands clearly how this translates into issues in my state and with our particular issues. But I am going to give the benefit of the doubt to a woman who I believe has demonstrated through her professional career to be deeply, deeply committed to matters of justice. And so I will be casting my vote in support of her in about an hour here. But Mr. President, I came to the floor today to talk about something that has been top of my mind for a period of time, and I wanted to bring it to members' attention today because of some recent articles of late as it relates to national security and global competitiveness, particularly as they relate to domestic resource development. In recent months, since the beginning of this administration, I've spoken out in concern at the direction that I've seen the new administration take with regards to energy security and how that relates to Alaska. I've spoken out at length about my opposition to several of these executive orders that were very early on relating to leasing and permitting moratoria in my state. In fact, there were 8 specific orders that were directed to one state and to one state only. That's a pretty hard hit for Alaska. In other areas, I don't believe that additional federal lands and waters in Alaska should be placed off limits. We are already, as a state, we hold more public lands than any other state, and by considerable degree. I don't believe our public land order removal process should be paused. This was an announcement that just came out of Department of Interior last week. They say they're pausing it, but effectively it could be delayed or abandoned, not just for these next 2 years going forward, but permanently. And what this effectively does is it creates almost de facto wilderness, if you will, because you have placed land in a limbo, in a purgatory for decades. Nobody can do anything with it as these PLOs, these public land orders, remain in place. No great secret around here. Like most Alaskans, I strongly support our resource development industry and the men and the women who work within it. They're my friends, they're my neighbors, I fish with them. I recognize the importance and the value of what they do, and I've worked hard here in the Senate and for a long time to ensure that the industry's continued centrality is allowed to prosper, not only because of them, the people that I know, but because of what it means for our country, for our economy, our state's budget, our prosperity, and also for our environment. After years of lagging behind, the United States has come to a better place on energy in recent years. We've seen domestic production rising. We've seen our emissions falling. We've created jobs. We've generated revenues. We've changed the world geopolitically, even as we have lessened our impact on the climate. But these kind of gains can't be taken for granted. They can't be actively ignored, and they certainly should not be discarded. We have to acknowledge that this energy renewal has not been even across the country. It's taken place largely on state and private lands. We've got very limited private land in Alaska, and state activity we've been proudly producing for a while. But we also have, again, much land that is federally held, and we've only seen help arrive with any kind of activity and production on federal land in the past few years. And I would suggest that we cannot afford that forward progress to be reversed. But unfortunately, that's the way it feels right now. The threat is that this administration is going to take an approach that is going to take us backwards. And so the question, I think, is a fair one for us to ask, to discuss here. It's an important question. What happens if we just decide we're going to turn our backs on this, our American energy? What happens if we really do move in this direction of just keep it in the ground? What happens if we really do close our eyes to our domestic energy sources, these assets, that we close our eyes to the contributions that they provide? And I'll suggest to you that there's a few warning signs that we have up on the horizon. Oil prices are back up above $60 a barrel. This actually helps my state. I'll be honest there. We'll accept that for budgetary purposes, but we all talk about what happens typically around Memorial Day. You've got driving season coming on. We're still in the midst of a pandemic. But if the U.S. artificially restricts its supplies and demand rebounds rapidly, where does this put us? And so I mentioned that there have been some articles of late that just really kind of struck me. And it's interesting because I thought they were pretty significant, but it seems like they're relatively unnoticed here in Washington. According to Bloomberg, Russia has now supplanted Saudi Arabia to be the third largest supplier of crude oil in the United States. Canada is our number one. But there's been a series of circumstances. As our domestic production is falling, the Saudis have also reduced theirs. And it's been Venezuela. Venezuela is subject to sanctions. Their production has pretty much gone offline to the United States. Part of what we're seeing, though, is the refusal on the federal government side to approve cross-border pipeline infrastructure. And so Canada, again, is our largest. We import more from Canada than anywhere else, and they've got greater capacity to help us out here so that we don't have to take it from Russia. But instead, we haven't been able to take more from Canada to fill in that gap because of pipeline capacity. So what happens is we're sending more of our money to Russia at a time when we're not on very good terms with Russia. Need we say elections? Need we say solar winds? Need we say, what we're seeing from Putin? So, but this is what's happening. We're sending more of our dollars to Russia, and they are sending us more of the resources that we could produce here at home, or perhaps at least import them from some friendlier nations. U.S. crude oil production fell from an average high of 12.2 million barrels per day in 2019 to an average of 11.3 million in 2020. According to the Energy Information Administration, this loss in domestic production will return the United States to being a net petroleum importer in 21 and 22. And by all accounts, a sizable chunk of this will come from Russia. So what's going to happen, Mr. President, is we're going to move from that position of where we have been in these past few years, where we have had some real energy security here, because we have been producing, and we've been producing to the point that we've been able to even supply to our friends and allies. But now, with policies that are taking us in a different direction, and still knowing that we need the resource, we're turning to Russia. And this is what really galls me so much. In 2020, the U.S. imported 538,000 barrels of oil per day from Russia. In Alaska, we recognize Alaska as the great producing state. Despite our immense potential and desire to bring it to market, in 2020, we're producing an average of 448,000 barrels per day. So it just begs the question, is this what we really want? Is this what we really want, for Russia to account for more of America's energy supply than Alaska's? Now, we both have similar environments, both big, but oil production goes on in areas that, that are tough to produce in. And I will hold Alaska's environmental record over that of Russia any day. In fact, over most countries and even most states any day. One article put it this way. They said, America's increasing reliance on Russian oil is at odds with U.S. energy diplomacy. And, you know, let's kind of put it in context. The position that we've taken with Nord Stream 2. Basically, what we've said is we're asking those in Europe who need Russia's gas, we're saying we need to be tough on this. We need to break Russia's hold here for all the right years. It's been 7 years since Russia annexed Crimea and demonstrated to the world that they're not afraid to flex their muscles when it comes to energy exports in order to achieve their geopolitical goals. So we've been saying on Nord Stream 2, you know, Europe, hey, you guys don't go there. And yet we have to look at ourselves here, because we then, if we're telling Europe, limit your reliance on Russia for gas, but over here, we're happy to step up our imports from Russia on oil. Now, the president has just recently imposed tougher sanctions on Russia, as he absolutely should. But I think we need to be eyes wide open here, folks, in terms of what it means when we need that resource. Now, I do recognize that much of this discussion in Russia and how Russia has supplanted Venezuelan crude, I recognize that most of the oil that's being imported is heavy, and that this is a situation with our Gulf Coast refineries that are specifically geared for that. And I do recognize that they have fewer options right now. But I do think that this is a conversation that we need to be talking about, that we just can't sit back and say, well, this is just the way it is. Congress and the administration need to be taking the steps necessary to ensure that we in this country have a strong, stable supply of domestic energy to meet our current demand, our future demand, and to the greatest extent possible, the demand from our allies. Russia is positioning itself to capitalize on all of that. They produce from wherever they want, and they're going to sell to wherever they can. And the least that we can do here at home is to support our own responsible production from states like Alaska, so that we've got our supply, our own supply, and can provide a diversified commercial alternative. So moving from oil and gas briefly here, Alaska is also ready to help in another increasingly crucial area, and that is with mineral development. Our history of tectonic events has created a geological environment that fosters deposits of a wide variety of minerals that are critical to both our current and our future economies. Back in 2018, the Department of Interior designated 35 critical minerals based on their importance to our economy and security, as well as their susceptibility to supply disruption. And these minerals are essential for everything. They help us with our advanced missile systems, solar panels, batteries for electric vehicles, your cell phones, everything. Our military is certainly aware of this. They recognize the vulnerable position that we are in. Our manufacturers recognize the vulnerability. These are products that we use on a daily basis. Right now, the U.S. is import reliant on 31 of the 35 minerals designated as critical. We've got relatively no domestic production. We rely completely on imports to meet our demand for 14 of these. And of course, most of where we are importing these materials are from China. That's not okay. It shouldn't be acceptable to us. I think we all should agree on the need to rebuild our domestic mineral supply chains, and there's been good, positive conversation about what we can do. But I feel that this is one of those areas of growing vulnerability. It used to be we would talk about our vulnerability on the Middle East for our oil, and then policies changed, and we reduced our reliance on that, and that's why I'm anxious, I'm concerned about what I'm seeing translate going forward. But I think we need to be, again, eyes wide open when it comes to our mineral dependence and our reliance on these important materials for what we need to be a strong nation. I think that this is a pressing, a long-term security threat that we face in this country. We've seen it play out in light of the COVID pandemic. We've seen the vulnerability of international supply chains. I thought it was great. It was so important that the administration really focused in on this. The new administration is focusing on this in a good way, and I appreciate that. When President Biden when he released the first part of his infrastructure proposal and focusing on international domestic supply chains, he's got one section there about electric vehicles. And in the White House fact sheet, it says that the plan will enable automakers to spur domestic supply chains from raw materials to parts, retool factories to compete globally, and support American workers to make batteries and EVs. This is a type of policy that we should all want to get behind, broaden out to every industry, not just to a select few. But the question here, though, is whether the administration is willing to accept that what is going to be necessary in order to achieve this goal, to have these secure supply chains, especially when it comes to expanding our domestic supply of raw materials, it's going to require approval of mining projects. And that's been a challenge for us. That's been a challenge for us. And this is where I go to another article that came up a few weeks back. This is from Reuters. But it appears to me that rather than looking within our own borders, the administration is looking beyond. In this article from Reuters, it states, U.S. looks to Canada for minerals to build electric vehicles. And it provides, the U.S. government is working to help American miners and battery makers expand into Canada, part of a strategy to boost regional production of minerals used to make electric vehicles and counter Chinese competitors. And it goes on further to talk about the different ways that the Department of Commerce is discussing with many how we can boost Canadian production of EV materials. It goes on further to say, but Washington is increasingly viewing Canada as a kind of a 51st state for mineral supply purposes. I'm a big fan of Canada. They're our neighbor. But if we're going to be adding Canada as a 51st state to help us with our minerals and access to minerals, let's not forget the 49th state, because Alaska has good, strong resources. Where we seem to have problems is gaining access through whether it's permitting process or just the ability to move forward with some of our mineral potential. And so, again, I'm not suggesting that we shouldn't be looking to our friends to build these alliances, particularly with our neighbors direct to the north and to the south. This is good. I'm not suggesting let's not be talking to Canada. This is an important part of how we really work to build these secure supply chains. All I'm suggesting is that we here in America need to also look to the strength of our resource assets. Now, there are some, again, the issue of mining in this country sometimes can be a controversial one, but I'm going to suggest to folks that if we really want to do more to build out not only our national security, but if we want to build out our clean, diverse energy infrastructure, moving towards the President's vision of greater renewable opportunities, which I want to do, let's acknowledge that we're going to need these minerals. We don't really have a choice here. The World Bank recently released a report looking at the mineral intensity of clean energy transition. They found that, quote, large relative increases in demand of up to nearly 500% are estimated for certain minerals, especially those concentrated in energy storage technologies such as lithium, graphite, and cobalt. The report also found that even with large increases in recycling, including scenarios where 100% end-of-life recycling is achieved, there is still likely to be strong demand for primary minerals. So we know we're going to need it. People like Elon Musk last year says, please mine more nickel. He promised, Tesla will give you a giant contract for a long period of time if you mine nickel efficiently and in an environmentally sensitive way. With you on that. Or look at the analysis from Goldman Sachs, who found an increasing demand for electric car batteries is causing automakers to brace for a surge in prices of lithium, cobalt, and nickel. So again, Mr. President, in order for us to get there from here, in order to achieve a transition to renewable and cleaner technologies, we've got to acknowledge that there's going to be a mineral footprint. It will be impossible to establish a robust domestic supply chain for EVs and batteries if we continue to import the raw materials from other nations, including some that continue to dramatically outcompete us in these areas every year. I think we need a rational, clear-headed, eyes wide open approach to energy and mineral development. We don't want to go back on energy, and we can't be caught flat-footed on minerals. We've got the resources. We have the highest labor standards in the world, the highest environmental standards in the world. Our energy workers, our miners, they'll hold themselves to those standards. So instead of importing more from places like Russia and China, we need to free ourselves from them to the extent that we can and establish ourselves as this global alternative. So I've kind of taken that. It was actually not something new. At the beginning of the 116th Congress, I prepared a white paper. We called it the American and Global, we called it the, it's a pretty cool title. It was a great little publication that should have gotten more notice, but like a good wine, it comes with time. With powers so disposed, America and the global strategic energy competition. And I outlined in this a strategic energy initiative designed to sharpen and direct our tools of energy related to economic statecraft and enhance the geopolitical position of the country. So I am introducing from that, as a jump off from that, I'm introducing my Strategic Energy and Minerals Initiative Act. We call it the SEMI-Act. This legislation will enable U.S. companies to better compete in global markets, promotes the responsible domestic production of our oil and our gas and our minerals. I think these are initiatives that are good for us to be looking critically at, again, as we move forward with this administration's priorities on not only how we can build infrastructure, build it better, build it cleaner, build it with a renewable future, but we have to recognize that when we build things, we need base elements. And so know that Alaska is ready, willing, and able to play a role on all these fronts. We've got tremendous stores of resources, but equal to those tremendous stores of resources is the responsibility that I believe Alaskans feel to be good stewards as we access those resources, to allow for a level of sustainability, whether it is with our fisheries or whether it is with the subsistence livelihoods of those who rely on the food and animals on the land. We believe that we can contribute to our national security and our global competitiveness while at the same time working to protect the environment. But what we need is the chance to be able to do so. With that, Mr. President, I thank you and I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
The senator from Iowa.
Thank you, Mr. President, very much. Mr. President, when you hear the word infrastructure, what comes to mind? For folks across Iowa, it's roads, it's bridges, locks and dams, ports, waterways, and broadband. But according to the Biden administration, infrastructure is now a buzzword that encompasses just about every item on the progressive wish list. As a result, the president's infrastructure proposal takes a very sharp left turn by including everything from elements of the socialist Green New Deal to higher taxes on American workers. Some of my Democratic colleagues are even urging the president to include a pathway to citizenship for millions of undocumented immigrants in the infrastructure package. How about we make the wall on our southern border infrastructure? Probably to no one's surprise, once again, the Senate Majority Leader is plotting to pass the bill in a totally partisan process. And folks, we really need to pump the brakes. The Democrats are steering us the wrong way on this issue. Infrastructure is an issue that has always enjoyed broad bipartisan support in Congress. We may disagree on how much to spend or how to pay for the costs, but we all agree that maintaining and improving our roads, bridges, ports, and waterways is one of the most important roles of the federal government. There is no reason to drive us apart on such an important issue that typically brings us together and impacts all of our states. But President Biden is on a one-way street to more gridlock. Only about 5 to 6% of the $2.2 trillion of the Biden proposal is dedicated to roads and bridges. The Biden plan spends less fixing potholes and repairing roads than it does on promoting electric vehicles and perks for the coastal elites that drive them. And you better believe this could have a devastating impact on Iowa's ethanol and biodiesel industries that support our state's local economies. Even the liberal Washington Post is taking issue with the Democratic administration's claim that 19 million jobs will be created by the proposal. The real number is less than 3 million. Each job created by this so-called American Jobs Act will cost our taxpayers $865,000. And because American workers will bear the brunt of the higher taxes in the Biden plan, that means lower wages. These costs are sure to give taxpayers road rage. Mr. President, there is no reason to take this radical left turn. Last Congress, Democrats and Republicans in the Senate Environment and Public Works Committee, which I serve on, worked together to unanimously pass out of committee an important infrastructure bill to help fix our roadways. This highway bill provides us with a great starting point to move us forward in the right direction towards a bipartisan infrastructure plan. This 5-year, $287 billion bill was the largest highway bill in history, and it was supported by senators from across the political spectrum who represented states from Vermont and New York to Alabama and Mississippi, and of course, Iowa. Hailing from a very rural part of Iowa, I am all for looking at ways to invest in broadband expansion, to support our roadways, and to make sure we have the right infrastructure in place to combat flooding in my home state. Those are true infrastructure needs, and the ones that I believe would get a strong bipartisan support in a 50-50 Senate. But by throwing in progressive policy wish list items and non-infrastructure related provisions, the Biden plan is headed down a dead-end street. The president needs to do a U-turn and start working with Republicans on a bipartisan roadmap for America. By putting aside the partisan pet projects like the Honolulu High-Capacity Transit Corridor project, and picking up where we left off with the unanimously bipartisan highway bill, we can steer the infrastructure bill into the passing lane under the Senate's regular order. So folks, let's come together and literally start building some bipartisan bridges. And with that, Mr. President, I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
The senator from Missouri.
Mr. President, I want to talk also about infrastructure and associate myself with the interest that the country has in infrastructure. In fact, one of the things that the government has done the longest has been roads and bridges and canals. And I think initially the term was internal improvements, was what in the early 19th century they would have talked about when they talked about what we began to talk about later as infrastructure. But during almost the entire history of the country, there was an understanding of what infrastructure meant in America, and infrastructure is pretty popular. Infrastructure is definitely something that you generally can't do for yourself. You can't on your own provide the water line that connects your house to the next house. On your own, you can't provide the road that gets you from home to work. On your own, you can't do a lot of things that we did early on and up till right now and called them infrastructure. Normally, they were seen as things like roads and bridges and dams, big projects that sometimes cross state lines, or big projects that sometimes were just too big for a state or a town to handle, like water systems that needed to be improved. And when we did that, I'll talk later about the way we did that. That bipartisan agreement also largely led to figuring out ways that infrastructure would pay for itself, that the people who use the infrastructure would pay for the infrastructure, and we looked at that in a number of different ways. Now, in the package that the administration has proposed, the $2.3 trillion package, there are lots of things in there that I don't disagree that the Senate should debate. I don't even rule out of hand that the country might want to do, but I think they're not infrastructure, and the funding way to get to them makes it harder to have the kind of bipartisan agreement that I think we could have in an infrastructure bill. Republicans are for it, Democrats are for it, in the House, in the Senate. Let's talk about how to get there, but let's also make the point that, you know, the $213 billion in this plan that is for Green New Deal building makeovers. There may be a place to do that. And it's something that, Mr. President, we could clearly debate, but it's not the same thing as infrastructure, where I was the chairman at one time of the Missouri Housing Development Commission. We did a lot of things to make it possible for people to have houses or people to have buildings that they could have an opportunity to be in part of that building, but we never really called it infrastructure, and we did it in a different way. On surface transportation, generally for decades, that was paid by the Highway Trust Fund. And how did you fund the Highway Trust Fund? You fund the Highway Trust Fund by people pulling up to a service station, putting fuel in their car, and when they did that, they paid into the Highway Trust Fund. The more miles you drove, the more you paid into the Highway Trust Fund, and Americans thought that was fair. Now, we haven't raised the highway gas tax since 1993. That could very well be a debate we should have as part of an infrastructure package. If not the gas tax, what other kind of user fee could there be? And lots of people use the highways, the roads, the bridges, the interstate highway system that don't pay gas tax now because they're transitioning to vehicles like electric vehicles that don't fill up at that gas pump. That's a debate I think we should have as part of an infrastructure debate. Just last year, it was predicted that the Highway Trust Fund would run out of money before the year was over, and it does, because we collect less money every year than we spend every year. So we've decided to subsidize that out of general revenue, but nobody in that debate ever thought that should be the permanent solution. Other kinds of projects, we look for ways to help the end user make a project possible, both in urban communities and rural communities. There are programs where you can replace your water system or your stormwater system with something that works, price it appropriately. And what we've done there is said, well, we're going to figure out how we can either guarantee your bonds or have or write down your loan, or both. And so the user in those systems over maybe 30 years would pay back in an amount they could afford. What happened when you turned the lead water pipe into an appropriate water pipe? And I'm in favor of replacing every lead water pipe in America, but I think you can do that in a way that the users of those systems pay for those systems, just like all of their neighbors in neighboring communities are paying for their system. We can help them do that, and we have proven we can help them do that. We could also create an infrastructure bank. Senator Warner and I have worked on that for years. I think we're going to reintroduce the Repair Act that would really be a nonpartisan financing authority where government guarantees of a certain amount of that money, and maybe government assistance in putting together a public-private partnership creates another way that a little bit of federal money creates a lot more infrastructure activity. You could look at these and other issues like asset recycling, where government leases or sells some existing public infrastructure and uses the proceeds of that to fund new projects. In Australia, they use that system to help pay for an expansion of subway systems and other things. And in fact, the federal government would encourage local governments to privatize one of their local government assets that had customers, and then they'd take that money maybe and build sidewalks that don't have customers. And the water system that did have customers would have helped build the sidewalks as It's managed by a private company, but all those private companies are regulated in a way that people who are customers know they're protected. We have a lot of bipartisan infrastructure bills over the last decades and more than decades. Infrastructure bills are not new to America. Figuring out how you have an infrastructure bill that meets the definition of infrastructure and a system where the infrastructure goes as far as it possibly can to pay for itself by those people that use it, it's always involved Republicans and Democrats reaching an agreement. I don't know that there's ever been a partisan infrastructure bill. It's always involved reaching an agreement on what would be in the bill and reaching an agreement on finding ways to pay for it. New definitions can really confuse ideas that the American people think they understand. People are for infrastructure. They think that's something the government should do. They can pass a test on what they believe infrastructure means if they've ever watched an infrastructure debate before. Let's find a way that we can move forward in a bipartisan way with an infrastructure bill that meets the standards of infrastructure and meets the standards of doing everything we can to be sure that that system is fairly paid for by people who use it and can afford to pay for it. With that, I'd yield back.
The senator from Wyoming.
Thank you, Madam President. I rise to echo and augment the remarks from the gentleman from Missouri and to call on President Biden and Democrats in Congress to work with Republicans on a bipartisan infrastructure bill. As the only senator in the unique position of sitting on all three committees with jurisdiction over transportation, I have a particular interest in making sure we are adequately funding our roads and bridges. I've had many conversations with my colleagues on both sides of the aisle since I joined the Senate, and everyone agrees that we have real infrastructure and transportation needs that must be addressed. The American Society of Civil Engineers recently gave our roads a D- rating, noting our $786 billion backlog on roads and bridges capital needs. They gave our bridges a C- rating and a repair tag of $125 billion. We also need to take another look at how we fund our highway system. Right now, we have a highway trust fund that we can't actually trust. Since 2008, we've been relying on general fund transfers to pay for our roads and bridges instead of fixing our user fee model to keep the trust fund solvent. User fees give users the benefit of seeing where their money is going and allows those people deriving the most benefit from the system to give the most in support. This is a very fair American way of doing things, and the certainty we get from a functioning user fee model is important for rural states like my home state of Wyoming. While much divides Congress these days, infrastructure, as that term is understood by most Americans, is a bipartisan issue. As such, one would assume that President Biden would want to find some common ground in order to build relationships in Congress and address the needs of every citizen. So it's perplexing that President Biden, who campaigned on bringing our nation together, is now pushing a blatantly partisan infrastructure bill. Let me show you why partisanship is unnecessary in the infrastructure space. I recently helped my Democratic colleagues on the Environment and Public Works Committee pass a bipartisan drinking water and wastewater infrastructure bill out of committee with unanimous support. This is clear evidence that Democrats and Republicans can come together on infrastructure issues and find common ground. In 2019, the EPW committee, under the leadership of my fellow senator from Wyoming, John Barrasso, unanimously passed a bipartisan 5-year highway funding bill. This would be a great place to start for any infrastructure bill in Congress. But this barely scratches the surface of bipartisan infrastructure legislation. Honestly, I'm hard-pressed to remember a time when infrastructure was not bipartisan. The American Water Infrastructure Act of 2018, bipartisan. The Water Infrastructure Improvements for the Nation Act of 2016, bipartisan. The Highway Transportation Funding Act of 2015, bipartisan. The Fixing America's Surface Transportation Act of 2015, bipartisan. The Water Resources Development Act of 2014, bipartisan. This isn't even a full decade of congressional action, and all of these things happened in partisan environments when Americans were divided on a host of issues. But despite our divisions, we've always come together to address American infrastructure. In 2021, this should be no different. If President Biden wants to truly unite the nation, he can start by working with Republicans on the most basic bipartisan issues. And he might be surprised which members of Congress are there to join him. I'll use myself as an example. I've opposed many of President Biden's actions to date, but I support his decision to bring our troops home from Afghanistan, and I am doing so publicly. I have also supported several of President Biden's nominees, including Secretary Buttigieg. I can promise President Biden that if he comes in good faith to work with Republicans and Democrats on a bipartisan infrastructure bill, I will be there to work with him every step of the way. I know my colleagues feel the same. All we're asking is for the unity president to come to the table. Thank you, Madam President. I yield back.
Madam President.
Senator from North Dakota.
Thank you, Madam President. I'm pleased to be able to join my Republican colleagues on the floor today, associate myself with all of the comments, especially the speech just delivered by my friend from Wyoming, and demonstrate my strong support for a significant investment in America's infrastructure. You know, as my colleagues have said, infrastructure has been one of the most bipartisan policy areas in Congress over the decades, and rightfully so. I mean, we are obligated to provide for the national infrastructure. And as the lead Republican on the EPW Subcommittee on Transportation and Infrastructure, I am committed to doing my part. I'm confident that we can accomplish this on a national level and in a strong bipartisan fashion. As has been said, 2 years ago, under the leadership of Chairman Barrasso, EPW unanimously passed America's Transportation Infrastructure Act. It was the most substantial highway bill yet in our history. It authorized hundreds of billions of federal dollars to maintain and repair America's roads and bridges, and it made reasonable regulatory changes, very important, Madam President, regulatory changes so that projects wouldn't get derailed by endless bureaucracy. It also maintained the current formula for deciding how states will receive the federal funds. This funding formula ensures that states with small populations but expansive road systems like North Dakota and Wyoming and Oklahoma receive the sufficient resources to update their roads and bridges within their borders. It is states like ours that feed and fuel the country. So not only does the traditional funding formula protect the interests of rural America, it protects all of America. The movement of goods and services in support of our economy, and the consumers cannot reserve a few thousand miles here and there of interstate for gravel. Interstate commerce requires a transportation system that is safe and sufficient for every mile. The pavement can't end in Minneapolis and get picked up in Seattle. For food to get to your table requires thousands of miles of safe, reliable roads, bridges, rails, and waterways. My state of North Dakota is literally the center of the North American continent and is a top producer of dozens of crops and other food items. For example, we're the very top producer, by a long ways, by the way, of durum. Durum is the wheat that is ground into semolina flour, which is the main ingredient in pasta. So if you love cooking spaghetti in your kitchen or ordering penne at your favorite restaurant, you have to get the durum off the field in North Dakota to the elevator where a train or a truck will pick it up and take it to the mill where it will be ground into semolina before getting on another truck or train to the pasta plant, then to the grocery warehouse in another state where it catches a ride to a distribution company or a retailer before it gets put into a pot of boiling water on its way to your plate in your Manhattan apartment or your favorite Los Angeles restaurant. That's why we included the formula in the last highway bill when I was in the House. It's why we kept it in the highway bill at the committee level last Congress, and there's every good reason why we ought to include it now. Under the leadership of Chairman Carper and Ranking Member Capito, EPW has had 2 hearings reiterating the importance of investing in America and dealing with the solvency of the Highway Trust Fund. It was disheartening to read a news story earlier this week, Madam President, and see how many of my colleagues are urging the President to not work with Republicans and to go it alone on infrastructure. One even said he was worried that Republicans would, quote, never show up. Well, here we are. We've shown up. And like I told Chairman Carper just last week, I believe we should go big. We should aim high. This is a tremendous opportunity to pass a major bill that will benefit our country as a whole and the states we represent. We cannot let one of the most bipartisan policy areas in Washington get derailed now because a narrow majority in the Senate decided to pursue a partisan, short-sighted goal instead. I'm committed to advancing an infrastructure package that is bold, bipartisan, and meets the demands of the moment. And I urge my colleagues to do the same. I yield.
Madam President.
The senator from Oklahoma.
Madam President, let me read to you a section of the proposal on infrastructure that's been put out by the White House. Just one section of many sections that's there. This particular section on national critical infrastructure reads this way: funds for schools to reduce or eliminate the use of paper plates and disposable materials. I don't know what your definition of infrastructure is, but I don't meet a lot of Oklahomans that when I say infrastructure, they think school lunch trays. We need to work on infrastructure. And I would tell you, I don't meet a Republican that's not engaged in this issue of infrastructure. And it's not the first time for any of us to work on infrastructure. We've had multiple bills. I remind people around my state that every time you're driving around my state and you see an orange construction zone and a flashing sign, that's a previous infrastructure bill that was done. In every direction that you go in my state, you're going to see infrastructure that's already happening and working. Because working on infrastructure is a common part of what we do. Republicans have stepped to the table and have said, let's work on infrastructure together. In fact, it was interesting, President Trump over and over again talked about working on infrastructure and trying to be able to get a major infrastructure proposal. Our definition of infrastructure, though, doesn't include school lunch trays. We'd like to work on highways. This particular package that the White House has sent us, we've just raised our hand and said we have a few questions before you want to be able to move this forward. This particular proposal spends $174 billion for electric vehicles, but only $115 billion for the highways that they'll drive on. We just believe we need to spend more on highways. We don't mind incentivizing electric vehicles, but quite frankly, there's been a lot of incentives out there already. Every Tesla that you pull up next to, when you turn over and see them at a stoplight, you should ask for your turn to drive. Because every one of those beautiful Tesla vehicles, the federal taxpayers also kicked in $7,800 in federal tax subsidies for that beautiful $60,000 automobile that someone else is driving. There have been tax incentives that have been out there for electric vehicles. We just believe we need to spend more on actually dealing with our roads and bridges because they're in major problems. So what can we do? For those of us in Oklahoma, we know full well, I-35, Interstate 44, Interstate 40, all cross in my beautiful state. We're the center of the country in trucking. We're the center of the country in railways. We have the farthest northernmost inland port that's actually in Oklahoma, where a lot of wheat and fertilizer moves through our state coming from the north to get into the ports to be able to get out. We understand the significance of what it means to be able to work on our ports, our waterways, our highways, our bridges, to deal with clean water, to deal with sewage water, to be able to deal with even broadband. All those things are essential for every farm to be able to operate and for every section of our economy to be able to function. Let's work on this together. Let's find a way that we can actually hit common ground and agree that working on airports and working on highways and working on bridges are vital to us. And then let's talk about the rest of the other things on this, because we have a lot of debt as a country. And adding another $2.5 trillion and having a debate about a corporate tax change that, quite frankly, in 2017, when we made that corporate tax change, 70% of that difference in those companies went to employees' wages. Now to go back and raise that corporate tax again, we know exactly what that's going to mean for employees of those companies and future raises that they may or may not get. So let's actually talk about this, and let's work on infrastructure together, but let's actually work on what is truly infrastructure. With that, I yield back.
Madam President.
The senator from Wyoming.
Thank you, Madam President. First, I ask unanimous consent that Senator Bozeman, Senator Marshall, and Senator Durbin all be permitted to speak for up to 5 minutes prior to the vote.
Is there objection? Without objection, so
Thank you,
moved.
Madam President. Madam President, I come to the floor today to associate myself with the remarks from the senator from Oklahoma. We are here as Republicans who believe in free markets, and so do the American people. The Democrats, on the other hand, are running a 100-yard dash towards socialism. They've decided to redistribute Americans' wealth. Remember, President Obama used to call this spreading the wealth around. Democrats are taking the wealth of our nation and they are gathering up in Washington, D.C. and deciding then how they want to spend it. In March, President Biden signed a big payoff to the people who run the Democrat Party, the union bosses, the D.C. bureaucrats, and bankrupt blue states. He said it was a coronavirus relief bill, yet only 9% of the money actually went for health care. Just weeks later, President Biden came back again, now requesting $2.7 trillion under the namesake of infrastructure. When you read through it, it looks like once again he's trying to spread the wealth around, gathering it not for what we consider traditional infrastructure, roads, bridges, ports, highways, airports, waterways, all of those things, dams, reservoirs, you name it. Seems that once again it's going for the Democrat elites. Looks to me to be a slush fund for liberal spending, going to union bosses, climate activists, and the Silicon Valley contributors to the party. Where's the money coming from? Well, the last bill went on the credit card. The next one is coming out of the wallets of the American people. President Biden is proposing the largest tax increase in a generation. Working families and small businesses are going to be on the hook. They'll put the American worker at a disadvantage. Look, there hasn't been a proposed tax increase of this size in this century. It's going to affect everyone in this country. And it's going to be a rude awakening for the many small businesses who are finally reopening after living the past year with the coronavirus pandemic. Now, in addition to the struggles they've been through, they're going to be hit with a big tax increase. Now, we know who is going to end up footing the bill for the president's tax hikes. He may say that it's just corporations. Madam President, the American people are going to be hit with this tax increase. You can call it a tax break, a tax cut on corporations that absolutely just ricochets back onto the people who work for those businesses and who buy the products of those businesses. President Biden is going to try to spin it another way. The highest costs of all of this are going to be borne by American families. Higher taxes, of course, mean fewer jobs. One estimate says that the bill is going to kill 1 million jobs. These aren't CEO jobs. These are middle-class jobs. These are the jobs of hardworking families in my state of Wyoming and states all around the country. Prices across the country are already going up under President Biden. Cost of energy went up 9% just last month. Gasoline prices are up over 50 cents a gallon since President Biden took office and started his executive orders attacking American energy. If this bill that's being proposed now under the name of infrastructure becomes law, well, we will note that the price increases are just beginning. Because of President Biden, more wealth is about to be taken from places all across middle America and certainly in my home state of Wyoming. And they'll be sent to the Democrat elites in Manhattan and Silicon Valley and, of course, here in Washington, D.C. Democrats are focused on redistributing our wealth. They want to take it from working families and give it to their liberal donors. It's a bad law, it's bad economics, and I urge my colleagues to stand for jobs, for higher wages, and for the working men and women of our nation who know what infrastructure really means and the kind of infrastructure that they need for their communities. Thank you, Madam President. I yield the floor.
Madam President.
Senator from Arkansas.
Thank you, Madam President. I join my colleagues today to address the ongoing discussions taking place in Congress, among the executive branch, and in communities across the country about the state of our nation's infrastructure and how to improve it to propel our economy forward and enhance the quality of life in Arkansas and every state. As a member of the Senate Environment and Public Works Committee, I understand the importance of infrastructure investment. I've been a constant advocate for water resources development, surface transportation investments, and the expansion of rural broadband. President Biden recently released a plan that claims to rebuild America, claims to rebuild its crumbling infrastructure. While I agree the infrastructure investment must be a top priority, I have serious concerns about this particular proposal. The President should look to the successful example of the Senate Environment and Public Works Committee as a starting point for this critical bill. There are a number of bipartisan infrastructure-related bills in the Senate which have been thoroughly vetted and are ready to be passed. Instead, the administration is trying to reinvent the wheel. My advice to President Biden is simple. The path forward to achieve long-term infrastructure improvement is through bipartisanship. Just weeks ago, the Environment and Public Works Committee unanimously passed the Drinking Water and Wastewater Infrastructure Act. Last Congress, the committee unanimously passed America's Transportation Infrastructure Act to provide resources and long-term certainty for states and local governments to build safer and more modern highways, railroads, and bridges. These bills are just two examples of the good work the Senate has been doing to invest in our nation's crumbling infrastructure. And I'm pleased to hear this chamber may begin consideration of the Drinking Water and Wastewater Infrastructure Act this month. Unlike the House of Representatives and the Biden administration, who continue to undermine bipartisanship by developing and advancing a progressive policy agenda, the Senate has been working in a bipartisan manner to find solutions for our transportation challenges. If President Biden is listening, my message to him is this: work smarter, not harder. There is no reason we need to start at the beginning of this process. The Senate EPW committee has done the work which can and should be the basis for any infrastructure proposal. I've always said that if you take the E out of EPW, we actually get a lot done in our committee. For a good example of the type of cooperation that can be achieved, look no further than the work of Senator Inhofe and former Senator Boxer. These two colleagues had little in common. However, they agreed on the importance of infrastructure investment, and they were able to usher major legislation through Congress through a collaborative and deliberative process. The same is true for Chairman Carper and Ranking Member Capito. While these two have ideological differences, they have demonstrated their ability to work together to create a bipartisan product. We want to work with the Biden administration on infrastructure to update basic public services such as safe roads and bridges. With innovative financing and private sector investment, we will be creating jobs and keeping commodity prices low while remaining competitive in the global marketplace. However, we will not tolerate a partisan process where only one side gets to offer input, with the end result being a liberal wish list of projects and priorities that have nothing to do with infrastructure investment. Infrastructure is about as ripe as any area that we have to actually get something done of a major nature in a bipartisan, cooperative way. I'm back in Arkansas almost every week,
And I can tell you what Arkansans want. They want us to be able to disagree while also creating good, common sense policy. A bipartisan infrastructure bill is a way to demonstrate the President's willingness to work across the aisle. I'm ready to create a path forward to update and modernize our nation's traditional infrastructure needs, as well as make wise investments in our water systems, energy grids, and broadband deployment, where there is bipartisan agreement on the urgent need to act. And with that, Madam President, I yield the floor.
Madam President.
The senator from Kansas.
Thank you, Madam President. Simply stated, President Biden's so-called infrastructure plan helps China and hurts hardworking Americans. Let me say it again. This bill helps China and hurts hardworking Americans. Less than 5%. That's how much of this $2 trillion infrastructure proposal actually goes towards building roads and bridges in the United States. Instead, this partisan proposal is loaded with Green New Deal pet projects and an abundance of spending that stretches far beyond recognition of what hardworking Americans define as infrastructure. This is not the first time we've seen Democratic attempts to redefine the traditional meaning of words. In recent weeks, the White House has also moved to change how people perceive bipartisanship in Congress. No longer do our colleagues across the aisle need to secure Republican votes in order to successfully pass a so-called bipartisan bill. One obscure poll with cleverly worded questions that helps to garner bipartisan support from respondents will do the trick. It's this manipulation of words that allow President Biden to keep trying to ram through this radical agenda and sell it to the American people as fulfilling his campaign promise of unity. President Lincoln once said, "You can fool all the people some of the time, and some of the people all the time, but you cannot fool all the people all the time." The American people won't be duped by Washington doublespeak. I hosted 5 town halls this past weekend, and Kansans have their eyes open to what's in this bill. Kansans understand that while this bill provides $115 billion for roads and bridges, more than half of the over $2 trillion is devoted to green energy projects and the elimination of fossil fuels. Among these green provisions is $170 billion for electric car chargers and tax incentives for purchasing electric cars. It also calls for electrifying 1/5 of the nation's school buses and all 650,000 of the United States Postal Service delivery trucks, which will result in driving up the cost to Americans. When unveiling this infrastructure plan, President Biden mentioned China 6 times as he attempted to sell it as a way to compete with China. However, this rapid jump to electric vehicles does the opposite and will benefit China more than many hardworking Americans. That's because China leads the world in manufacturing 80% of the materials needed for batteries and will continue to do so. Of the 136 lithium-ion battery plants in the pipeline between now and 2029, 101 are based in China. China mines 64% of the world's silicon and makes 80% of the world's polysilicon with coal-generated electricity, the key component to solar panels. This bill will serve as a boon for China while decimating our domestic oil and gas industry that helps us achieve our long-held goal of energy independence in 2019. This bill will harm our general economic output by taking $2 trillion out of the private sector. We should really be calling this package the Grab Your Wallet Bill or Raise Your Taxes Bill. The legislation calls for the largest corporate tax increase in decades and will put the tax burden on American companies toward the top of the developed world list. This will make American companies less competitive in the global market. It's a recipe to kill the economy at a time when our nation is still recovering from COVID. It will also negatively impact our economy in the long term. According to provisions from Penn-Wharton budget model, as a result of this partisan legislation, overall GDP will be decreased 0.9% lower in 2031 and 0.8% lower in 2050. Hourly wages will be down by 0.7% in 2031 and 0.8% in 2050. Perhaps what's most disappointing is this bill demonstrates that gone are the days when infrastructure packages were an opportunity to build bipartisan bridges. Thanks to Republicans' control of the Senate, And reaching across the aisle, the two most recent bills governing spending on roads and bridges both passed with overwhelming bipartisanship support before they were signed into law. So in case there's still an opportunity for bipartisanship, let me tell you what I'm for. I'm for a package that, number one, reaches across the aisle and rebuilds our aging roads and bridges. Next, incentivizes innovation, invest in future generations, ensures high-speed internet for all Americans, and reforms our permitting process so that we can say shovel-ready. We really mean shovel-ready, as opposed to going through years of permitting and driving up the cost of the project. Look, pre-COVID, we had the strongest economy in my lifetime thanks to Republican-led policies put in place over the last 4 years. Lower taxes and deregulation resulted in historically low unemployment rates, as well as American energy independence and affordable energy costs. We need to get back to these policies, not continue the onslaught of harmful red tape, proposed tax increases, and unprecedented spending sprees. For the future of our children and grandchildren depend on it. Thank you, Madam President. I yield back.
Madam President,
Majority Whip.
I would guess if the American people could give us a word of advice in the United States Senate, they would suggest that we do our best to work together, that we try to establish priorities and meet them, and that we try to bring to the new administration of President Joseph Biden the most competent, qualified people that we can to help our nation through this pandemic and our economic recovery. And it's in that spirit that I close the debate on Vanita Gupta to be the next Associate Attorney General of the United States. Yesterday's verdict in Minnesota certainly caught the attention of many in America and across the world. The killing of George Floyd was resolved in a court of law. Sadly, he will not be with us, but his legacy lives on. And it depends on us to use that legacy to make America a better nation. Can we really come together, put law enforcement at the table with community leaders and civil rights leaders and find common ground? Can we keep our streets and communities and neighborhoods safe and do it without discrimination against any person or group in America? These are big challenges, tough challenges. But to meet them, we need the right people in positions of leadership. Vanita Gupta is one of those people. As former civil rights advocate, she did extraordinary things in Tulia, Texas, and many other places to show progress in the area of civil rights. As a former Associate Attorney General in charge of civil rights, she worked with law enforcement organizations to try to resolve the very problems that we've seen in Minnesota, in Illinois, and virtually in every other state. She is a dedicated professional with an extraordinary resume who wants to continue to serve this nation. Will she be able to work with law enforcement groups? Well, they think so because they support her. There's a long litany. National Sheriff's Association, Major County Sheriff's Association, International Association of Chiefs of Police, Major Cities Chiefs, 53 former police chiefs or sheriffs, the Police Executive Research Forum, the Federal Law Enforcement Officers Association, the list goes on and on. But the simplest statement that was made comes from a pretty hard-nosed group, the Fraternal Order of Police. And those of us in politics know you have to work to earn their support. Here's what they said about Vanita Gupta. Gupta always worked with us to find common ground, even when that seemed impossible. Isn't that exactly what we want at this moment in American history? As we cope with the civil rights challenges of our age, this is our chance. I hope the Senate, with its vote, I hope it is a bipartisan vote, will give Vanita Gupta the chance to serve America again. I yield back my time and ask for the yeas and nays.
All post-cloture time is expired. The question is on the nomination. Is there a sufficient second? There appears to be. The clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Baldwin, Mr. Barrasso, Mr. Bennett, Mrs. Blackburn, Mr. Blumenthal, Mr. Blunt, Mr. Booker, Mr. Bozeman, Mr. Braun, Mr. Brown, Mr. Burr, Ms. Cantwell, Mrs. Capito, Mr. Cardin. Gotcha. Thank you. This is what happens. Thank you. Mr. Carper. Mr. Casey. I did, thank you. Hold on just a minute. Mr. Cassidy. Ms. Collins. Mr. Coons. Mr. Cornyn. Ms. Cortez Masto. Mr. Cotton. Mr. Kramer. Mr. Crapo. Mr. Cruz. Mr. Daines. Ms. Duckworth. Mr. Durbin. Ms. Ernst. Mrs. Feinstein. Mrs. Fisher. Mrs. Gillibrand. Mr. Graham. Mr. Grassley. Mr. Haggerty, Ms. Hassan, Mr. Hawley, Mr. Heinrich, Mr. Hickenlooper, Ms. Hirono, Mr. Hoven, Mrs. Hyde-Smith, Mr. Inhofe, Mr. Johnson, Mr. Kane, Mr. Kelly, Mr. Kennedy, Mr. King, Ms. Klobuchar, Mr. Langford, Mr. Leahy, Mr. Lee, Mr. Lujan, Ms. Lummis, Mr. Manchin, Mr. Markey, Mr. Marshall, Mr. McConnell, Mr. Menendez, Mr. Merkley, Mr. Moran, Ms. Murkowski, Mr. Murphy, Mrs. Murray, Mr. Ossoff, Mr. Padilla, Mr. Paul, Mr. Peters, Mr. Portman, Mr. Reed, Mr. Risch, Mr. Romney, Ms. Rosen, Mr. Rounds, Mr. Rubio, Mr. Sanders, Mr. Sass, Mr. Schatz, Mr. Schumer, Mr. Scott of Florida, Mr. Scott of South Carolina, Mrs. Shaheen, Mr. Shelby, Ms. Sinema, Ms. Smith, Ms. Stabenow, Mr. Sullivan, Mr. Tester, Mr. Thune, Mr. Tillis, Mr. Toomey, Mr. Tuberville, Mr. Van Hollen, Mr. Warner, Mr. Warnock, Ms. Warren, Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Wicker, Mr. Wyden, Mr. Young. Senators voting in the affirmative: Cardin, Durbin, Hassan, Kelly, Klobuchar, Murray, Rosen, Schatz, Sinema, Stabenow, Tester, Warnock, and Wyden. Senators voting in the negative: Barrasso, Cotton, Daines, Ernst, Grassley, Haggerty, Hyde-Smith, Kennedy, Langford, Lee, Lummis, Marshall, Paul, Rounds, Tillis, and Tuberville. Mr. Sullivan, no. Ms. Duckworth, aye. Mr. Manchin, aye. Mr. Bennett, aye. Mr. Ossoff, aye. Mr. Cornyn, no. Mr. Casey, aye. Mr. Bozeman, no. Mr. Hoeven, no. Mr. Warner, aye. Mr. Kramer, no. Mr. Heinrich, aye. Mr. Cruz, no. Mrs. Fisher, no. Mr. King, aye. Mr. Reed, aye. Ms. Cortez Masto, aye. Mrs. Blackburn, no. Ms. Murkowski, aye. Ms. Cantwell, aye. Mr. Kane, aye. Mr. Peters, aye. Ms. Smith, aye. Mr. Young, no. Mr. Graham, no. Mr. Blunt, no. Mr. Romney, no. Mrs. Feinstein, aye. Mrs. Shaheen, aye. Mr. Scott of Florida, no. Mr. Shelby, no. Mr. Hickenlooper, aye. Mr. Wicker, no. Ms. Collins? No. Mr. Merkley, aye. Mr. Markey, aye. Mr. Inhofe, no. Ms. Warren, aye. Mr. Blumenthal, aye. Mr. Carper, aye. Mrs. Gillibrand, aye. Mr. Booker, aye. Mr. Risch, no. Mr. Toomey, no. Mr. Van Hollen, aye. Mr. Rubio, no. Ms. Hirono, aye. Mr. Moran, no. Mr. Portman, no. Mr. Braun, no. Mrs. Capito, no. Mr. Hawley, no. Ms. Baldwin, aye. Mr. Scott of South Carolina, no. Did you? I did. I'm sorry, I didn't rec. Mr. Cassidy, no. Mr. Seth, no. Mr. Burr, no. Mr. Lujan, aye. Mr. McConnell, no. Mr. Brown, aye. Mr. Thune, no. Mr. Leahy, aye. Mr. Sanders, aye. Mr. Menendez, aye. Mr. Whitehouse, aye. Mr. Crapo, no. Mr. Murphy, aye. Mr. Coons, aye. Mr. Padilla, aye. Just Schumer. And they have one. Mr. Johnson, no. Mr. Schumer, aye.
Are there any senators in the chamber wishing to vote or change his or her vote? If not, the yeas are 51, the nays are 49, and the nomination is confirmed.
Thank you, Madam President. First, I just want to say, before I move on a motion to discharge, it is really so good to have Vanita Gupta now installed as Associate Attorney General. She will be, to have someone with such a background in civil rights at this time in American history is so important and so vital to the country. And I'm so glad that the Senate has now approved her and she can do her vital job, including dealing with the systemic bias we've seen in policing and in law enforcement throughout the country. So it's very good news for the forces of equality and justice in the country. With that, now, pursuant to, sorry.
Will the senator suspend?
Madam President,
The Majority Leader.
I ask that the motion to reconsider be made and laid upon the table with no intervening action or debate, and the Senate be immediately notified of the Senate, and the President be immediately notified of the Senate's actions.
Without objection, so ordered.
Now, Madam President, pursuant to Senate Resolution 27, the Committee on Armed Services being tied on the question of reporting, I move to discharge the Committee on Armed Services from further consideration of the nomination of Colin Hackett Call of California to be Undersecretary of Defense for Policy.
Under the provisions of S-Res 27, there will now be up to 4 hours of debate on the motion, equally divided between the two leaders or their designees, with no motions, points of order, or amendments in order. The clerk will call the...
I ask unanimous consent the quorum be vacated. Oh, I ask consent that the time be equally divided during the quorum call.
Without objection.
Thank you, Madam President, and I note the absence of quorum.
The clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Baldwin.
We're not.
A short while ago in the Senate, they approved the nomination of Vanita Gupta to be Associate Attorney General. The vote was 51 to 49. Republican Lisa Murkowski was the sole Republican to vote in favor. The Vice President, Kamala Harris, had been standing by in case she needed to break a tie on the nomination, but it was Lisa Murkowski's vote, both on cloture and the final confirmation vote, approving Vanita Gupta.
Senior Senator from Oklahoma.
I ask unanimous consent that the quorum call in progress be vitiated.
Without objection.
Thank you, Madam President. Let me start by urging my colleagues in the Senate to vote against the motion to discharge from the Senate Armed Services Committee the nomination of Colin Kahl for Undersecretary of Policy. You know, this is not a decision that I take lightly. I've always felt that any new administration should have his team or her team, and I've generally been very supportive. When President Biden nominated Dr. Kahl for this position, my expectation was that if confirmed, he and I would often disagree on policy, but we would actually get along together. We could coexist together. But I quickly learned that this would really be impossible with Dr. Kahl. And I don't think I've ever said that about anyone, any nominee for any position that I can recall. My Republican colleagues in the Senate Armed Services Committee, all 12 of them, reached the same conclusion. We opposed his nomination unanimously. That's very unusual. Before I explain why no Republican, not a single one, was able to support Dr. Kahl's confirmation in committee, I want to emphasize how rare this is. The Senate Armed Services Committee, as everyone knows, is extremely bipartisan. Certainly, the years that I was chairing that committee with the ranking member, Jack Reed, we got along famously. We got things done other people couldn't get done. The Senate Armed Services Committee has always been bipartisan. We have disagreements, of course, but Republicans and Democrats on the committee have a legacy of consensus. The national security and taking care of our troops, these are bipartisan concerns. And this is how we've been succeeded in passing the National Defense Authorization Act. The National Defense Authorization Act is the largest bill every year. It's the one where it sets out the guidelines for the coming year, and it's one where we've always gotten along. And we've passed it every year for 60 consecutive years. So it shows and demonstrates very clearly how well we get along. The department deserves a nominee with bipartisan credibility. You got to keep in mind that this position is the number 3 position in the Pentagon. It represents our shared bipartisan vision of effective national security and healthy civil-military relations. Now, this position demands a nominee who can carry out the president's policies while engaging those who disagree in good faith. And that isn't the case with this nominee. And that's why we're faced with this vote today. I also want to clear up a common misunderstanding. Republicans on the committee did not vote against Dr. Kahl simply because we disagreed with his policy views. Now, policy is what that position is. It's the policy position of the Pentagon. This should be obvious to anyone who paid attention to the confirmation of President Biden's nominees for Secretary of Defense, and Deputy Secretary, both of them. We got through quick. I don't remember a time when any new administration got the 2 very significant positions of Secretary of Defense and Deputy Secretary of Defense so fast. We got them in just record time. And there are some things that we disagree with policy-wise, but we supported their confirmation, as did what most of my Republican colleagues, for one reason. They were eminently qualified. I'm talking about the Secretary of Defense and the Deputy Secretary. Both of them were eminently qualified with long track records of bipartisan cooperation and strong professional judgment. I've dealt with both of them for many, many years. In fact, we expedited the nomination to give the president his national security team just about as quickly as we could. Republicans may disagree with him, but we can work with them very well. Unfortunately, the same cannot be said of Colin Kahl. The national security problems we face are wicked and complex. We wrestle with them constantly on this committee. What I cannot support are nominees who reduce complex national security conversations to partisan sound bites. For instance, as many of my colleagues will recall, back in October of 2019, Republicans and Democrats disagreed about our policy in Syria. When President Trump announced a full U.S. troop withdrawal from northeastern Syria, some of our colleagues worried about extended deployments. And this is a reasonable concern. But here's how Dr. Kahl chose to characterize it. Republicans are the party of ethnic cleansing, he wrote. He actually said that publicly. Good and kind people can disagree with each other. They don't have to resort to name-calling and accusations of war crimes. And that's not an isolated example. As we discovered during our review of Kahl's writings and public statements, he often embraces conspiracy theories. For example, he alleged the Kushner-Kremlin quid pro quo. Well, that was referring to the president's son-in-law, and when given the opportunity to correct this type of conspiracy theory during his confirmation hearings, he refused to do it. He stood by those statements. Dr. Kahl has also a long history of claiming that every policy decision with which he disagrees will lead to war, and thankfully, he's never been right. Dr. Kahl predicted that President Trump's decision to withdraw from the Iran deal would lead to war. It didn't. He said by sanctioning Iran's foreign minister, President Trump was boxing himself into a war. There was no war. It didn't happen. At one point, Dr. Kahl suggested that President Trump might start a war with Iran for political diversionary purposes. That's a quote. This is a ridiculous claim. Obviously, it didn't happen. And according to Dr. Kahl, the strike on Iranian terrorist leader Soleimani, the appointment of John Bolton as National Security Advisor, and the events of the Korean Peninsula, all others were going to lead to war. And none of the wars came, none of them happened. His public declarations of policy judgment are consistently partisan and consistently wrong. The Undersecretary of Defense for Policy deserves as the Defense Secretary's top national security advisor. It requires a leader with sound judgment and even temperament, and Colin Kahl simply doesn't possess either one of these qualities. Even worse, Dr. Kahl has a long track record of maligning people that he disagrees with. I mentioned the Syrian example earlier. He's also said that the Republican Party has a death cult fealty to Trump. That's seriously what he said. The bare minimum for Defense Department's top policy position is good judgment and even temperament. Dr. Kahl lacks both of these qualifications. It would set a terrible precedent if we confirm someone like him for the job. And I have a history of working so well with people on both sides, which is why I can and have supported many nominees whose policy views differ from mine. And that goes with the job. We have someone who's elected president of the United States. I disagree with him on many of the issues having to do with our defense policy. But because I trust that, while we may disagree, they understand that we're all trying to do the right thing for our nation and for our kids and our grandkids. Unfortunately, I don't have that trust in Dr. Kahl. Confirming him would create a real political challenge for the department over the years to come. Every time DOD lays down a new policy or makes a critical military decision, we will have to wonder, was this a decision informed by the department's skilled professionals or by the partisan conspiracy theorist who happens to run the department? And that's why all 13 Republicans on the Armed Services Committee voted to reject this nominee. And this is why I urge my colleagues to vote against the motion to discharge and urge President Biden to consider another nominee, one who we can work with productively with both sides of the aisle, even when we disagree. And so, Mr. President, I would like to have you consider these things and make your job and my job a lot easier. I yield the floor. Just the absence of quorum.
The clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Baldwin. Madam President.
The junior senator from Alaska.
Madam President, I ask that the quorum call be eviscerated.
Without objection.
I ask unanimous consent to engage in a colloquy with my friend and colleague, Senator Scott from Florida.
Without objection.
Madam President, I'm honored to be on the Senate floor with my colleague, Senator Scott from great state of Florida. And we are here to talk about an issue that really matters to both Alaska and to Florida, and I would say it actually matters to the whole country. Let me begin by just saying, like all states, my state, the great state of Alaska, struggled through the pandemic, a lot of challenges. I'm proud to say that with regard to the health challenges of the pandemic, I'm very honored and privileged and proud to represent a great group of Americans, my fellow Alaskans, who came together on the health side despite our huge challenges in terms of a giant state, dispersed population. We worked together, and on so many indicators of health directly related to the pandemic, Alaskans did very well. We were #1 per capita in terms of testing throughout almost the entire pandemic. Remarkably, we've been the #1 state per capita in terms of vaccine distribution, which is a mini miracle if you know Alaska, given how big it is. We had vaccines going out on snow machines, dog sleds, you name it. We were getting it out to everybody in a more efficient way than any other state in the country. And importantly, thank God, one of the lowest per capita death rates in the country. So we're proud of that, Madam President, but our economy, like many, but I would say almost uniquely, is getting hammered. And people are suffering economically first by the pandemic, of course, and now, unfortunately, by our own federal government. Let me just give you a couple examples. The energy sector, very important to Alaska, very important to America. Yes, we still need energy. Oil and gas, we need it. We have some of the greatest workers in the world in my state. The Biden administration thinks we don't need it. They've been crushing my state. 9 executive orders directed solely at the state of Alaska by this administration to shut us down. 9. There's no state in the country getting that kind of attention. We don't want that attention. Commercial fishing. Our state has been what I like to call the superpower of seafood. Over 60% of all seafood harvested in America comes from Alaska. That has been hurt by the pandemic. And the issue that we're here to talk about today, Madam President, tourism. So important to Alaska, so important to Florida. And that's what I want to talk about with my good friend, Senator Scott, to bring relief to our fellow Americans, Floridians, Alaskans, to work to immediately pass the Cruise Act. That is our bill, which would provide relief to coastal communities in our country, in Alaska, in Florida, to enable responsible return of cruise ship activities that are so important to the small business owners in our states whose livelihoods depends on a robust tourism sector. So let me just very quickly, Madam President, mention one thing. Alaska is open for tourism. One of the most beautiful places in the world. In fact, America, you want to come and have a great vacation? Come on up to Alaska this summer. Not only will you have an amazing experience, we just announced 2 days ago you can get a vaccine. Come on up. If your state's too inefficient to get a vaccine, have a great vacation in Alaska, and you'll get a vaccine in Alaska as well. You can do both. You can see the most beautiful state in the country. You can fish, see glaciers, wildlife, climb mountains, whale watch. And if you do that, it's going to help our economy, help the small businesses, fishing guides, hotels. I know Americans want to help one another. That's what we've been doing for the last year. We want you to come up, stay safe, get a vaccine. But here's what we need. To enable that to happen in Alaska and other parts of the country, we need the CDC to better understand their job, their mission, and their role. And this in particularly relates to the issues of cruise ship passengers, the ability for cruise ship vessels to start to return to America's waters as they're doing throughout the rest of the world. Asia, Europe, Latin America, people are cruising safely right now. But the CDC, Madam President, is dragging its feet. They're dithering. I have been meeting, my staff has been meeting with them almost certainly weekly. I've met twice with the CDC executive director. And all we get is foot dragging. All we get is excuses. All we get is guidance that's muddled, confusing, simply unworkable. And here's the thing. In my state, communities are dying. And no one seems to care. At the CDC, the bureaucrats there don't seem to give a damn about what Americans are suffering through right now. Literally. I don't know how many times we can be on calls with them where we get no response. And when people lose jobs and lose businesses, that is a health impact too. So here's what our simple bill does, the Cruise Act. First, it would require the CDC to issue recommendations for how to mitigate the risks of COVID-19 to passengers and crew on board ships. This would be in addition to what the industry has already put forward, and there are over 70 recommendations. Second, our bill would establish an interagency working group that will develop recommendations to facilitate the resumption of passenger cruise ships operations in the United States, in Florida, in Alaska. The recommendations will facilitate the resumption of passenger cruise ship operations no later than July 4th, 2021. Our bill requires the CDC no later than that same date, Independence Day, to revoke the order entitled Framework for Conditional Sailing and Initial Phase COVID Testing Requirements for Protection of Crew. And our bill finally ensures that the DHS and CDC retain all appropriate authorities to make and enforce regulations necessary to prevent the introduction, transmission, or spread of communicable diseases on individual cruise ships. Madam President, this is a common sense bill. We need the CDC to continue to work with us, certainly, but to recognize that by dragging their feet, tens of thousands of Americans are going to continue to suffer when they don't have to. We can do this responsibly. My state, the state of Florida, want to do this responsibly, but we can't wait any longer. Our tourism season in Alaska is very short. Our businesses need to know that they can open again, and our citizens need help. I yield the floor to my colleague from Florida, whose citizens are experiencing some of the same devastating impacts that my fellow Alaskans are.
Madam President.
The junior senator from Florida.
Madam President, I do want to compliment my colleague. He comes from a beautiful state. While I would like all the tourists to come to Florida, Alaska is a great state to take a vacation. I've had the opportunity to do that a few times, and it's a beautiful state. I want to thank my colleagues, Senator Sullivan and Senator Rubio, for working on this bill that is so important to all of our states, but for sure Florida and Alaska. Many states rely on the success of our ports, our cruise line, and our maritime industries. Throughout my time as governor of Florida, we proudly welcome more than 100 million visitors every year, shattering annual tourism records each year. Every visitor to our state supports small businesses, fuels job growth, and boosts tax revenue, helping increase state and local investments in the environment, transportation, public safety, and education. And it's not just Florida and Alaska. Tourism, including all of our all-important cruise industry, has huge impacts for states across our nation and the thousands of jobs that rely on its success. In this chart, you can look at this. So first off, the cruise industry shutdown is killing a lot of jobs, and jobs all across this country. Before the COVID-19, we had 450,000 American jobs and $55 billion in GDP every year in our economy. Unfortunately, due to the suspension of cruises, caused by the CDC inaction, more than 300,000 American jobs have been lost. So this is all across our country. As we continue to work to recover from the coronavirus and get our economy back on track, I remain committed to doing everything I can to support our tourism industry in Florida, Alaska, and all across the country in a safe manner. Unfortunately, while many sectors of the economy have been safely operating for months under CDC guidelines, Floridians and those across the nation that rely on the cruise industry for work continue to wait for updated guidance from the CDC. For months, I've heard from small business owners who have shared just all their stories about how important tourism is to them, and specifically the cruise industry is to their livelihood and how much the CDC's decision here has hurt them. Let me give you an example. Omar Otero, founder and owner of VOK Protective Services, who says, as a business owner, I've been dependent on the cruise industry for my livelihood for 20 years, and this pause has been devastating. What many people don't see behind the scenes is that cruising has a significant impact on many small businesses and employs hundreds of thousands of people in America. Resuming cruising is critical to my business and will allow me to work again and support my family. Jeanette Pinheiro, president of Cruise Port Destination, who says, the uncertainty we've been living with this last year is probably the most devastating mentally for a business owner. I have former employees that are still unemployed. They want to get back to work, and there's been nothing I could do. The cruise industry needs to be treated on par with other sectors of the travel industry, and this legislation would provide a plan to safely resume cruise operations. Madam President, I ask unanimous consent that the statements from these business owners be placed in the record.
Without objection.
The CDC's refusal to properly address this shutdown is wrong. It's time to get the cruise industries open, and it's going to create jobs all across our country. That's why I'm proud to join my colleagues, Senator Sullivan and Senator Rubio, in introducing the Cruise Act, which says we are not waiting on the CDC any longer. In March, President Biden announced the effort to vaccinate all Americans, his plan to vaccinate all Americans by July 4th. As of this week, all adults will be able for COVID-19 vaccines. Our nation has made enormous progress in fighting COVID-19, yet the CDCs continue to act like we're still in March 2020. Meanwhile, as my colleague from Alaska said, there's cruising all over the rest of the world. My colleagues and I are simply asking the CDC to provide a timeline when the cruise industry can begin to reopen like so many other sectors, and the Cruise Act ensures they can do that in a safe manner. The CDC is treating the cruise sector unfairly, while other industries are open for business. There is no reason why America's cruise industry and the thousands of jobs that rely on its success should continue to suffer. Cruises can and should resume, and we're going to do everything we can to bring back cruising safely. I reel back to my colleague from Alaska.
Madam President.
The junior senator from Alaska.
Madam President, as if in legislative session, I ask unanimous consent that the Committee on Health be discharged from further consideration of S. 1105 and the Senate proceed to its immediate consideration. I ask unanimous consent that the bill be considered read a third time and passed, and that the motion to reconsider be considered made and laid upon the table.
Is there objection?
Madam President.
The senator from Washington.
Madam President, reserving the right to object. I understand the position of my colleagues from Alaska and Florida who want to see a return to cruising by July 4th. I'm there with them. The cruise industry in my home state supports over 5,500 jobs and creates $900 million in annual local business revenue. Those jobs and that impact on the local economy have been severely disrupted. But we have to ensure the safety of our friends and our families on these cruises before they disembark. We have seen firsthand how devastating COVID outbreaks on cruise ships can be. Just last year, we saw thousands of passengers stranded on cruise ships, people put in quarantine, or refused entry to ports as borders closed. Over 31 million Americans have contracted COVID, and 560,000 have died from this disease. Cruise ships require specific focus and protocols in place to prevent future outbreaks. While I'm as eager as anyone else to see a return to travel, we cannot cut corners. Doing so risks lives and will only further delay returning to normal hurting our economy more in the long run. We must trust the science, and we must allow the CDC to continue its work to help us return to what we love as safely as possible. So I will continue to work with CDC and the administration as they develop the next phase of their cruising guidance. But for now, I object.
Objection is heard.
Madam President.
The junior senator from Alaska.
Madam President, to my colleague from Washington, who I have the utmost respect for, it is true that at the beginning of the pandemic, there were all kinds of challenges with the cruise ship industry. There's no doubt about that. We saw that. But that was well over a year ago. We didn't know anything about the virus then. We didn't have vaccines then. And we didn't see the economic devastation then. It is a very different period right now, a year later. Madam President, what we are asking for is the CDC to move. That's what our bill does. You know, Senator Murkowski and I had a meeting, our second meeting with the CDC director just 3 weeks ago. And in that meeting, she told us that they were going to issue all the guidance for the cruise ships, issue it all so people can plan. They said that they could anticipate with this guidance that we could meet cruising opportunities to start by mid-July in Alaska. They said that with this guidance, the CDC wouldn't have to be approving every move going forward. And they said they would take into consideration this huge progress we have made on vaccinating Americans. There's huge, in my state, in Southeast Alaska, there's communities with 60, 70, 80% vaccination rates. That's where these cruise ships are going to be going. The unfortunate thing, Madam Secretary, not one thing the director of the CDC told us turned out to be true. That's not good. Her staff or somebody in the CDC needs to be held responsible for telling us something that was not true at all. Again, what is happening right now is an economic and health devastation. In my state, the estimates are up to $3 billion worth of damage just in Alaska alone because of the foot-dragging, missed messages, and unresponsiveness when it comes to the CDC's guidances. My friend from Florida just mentioned airlines, schools, hospitals, hotels have all gotten CDC guidance and have been able to open. But for some reason, they are focused on this industry, which negatively impacts thousands of small businesses across America, in Florida, in Alaska. And I certainly hope that the CDC, seeing that we are trying to move this, and it's a bipartisan issue, by the way, will start to do its job. Will start to do its job and make the commitment that was made to me and other senators to get this moving quickly in terms of guidance so we can be having tourism, cruise ships, and otherwise in America by mid-July. That's what I was told by the director 3 weeks ago. They need to keep that commitment. Madam President,